They will tell you that Gideon Thorne was a man, that he arrived in the winter of 1851 walking out of a snowstorm that had already buried half the county, that his face was gaunt, his clothes strange, his eyes unblinking. But that's not the truth. The truth is this: Gideon Thorne was delivered. It was just after midnight when the blizzard swallowed the town of Ashford Hollow, Vermont, a place so far from anywhere that the mapmakers forgot it. In the white silence between howling gusts, a figure appeared at the edge of Main Street, not stumbling, not struggling, but moving with the quiet certainty of someone returning home. His coat was unlike anything the townsfolk had seen. Not wool, not leather, but something darker, like the hide of an animal that no one could name. And it was dry, though the snow clung to everything else like death. They watched him from behind shuttered windows, their candles guttering as if the air itself recoiled from his presence. The wind seemed to bend around him. By morning, Gideon Thorne had a bed at the inn, a seat by the fire, and the quiet attention of every man, woman, and child who dared to meet his gaze. He said he came from beyond the ridges, a place where the sun fell differently on the snow and the night lasted longer than the day. He spoke in a voice that was steady, almost soothing, but threaded with something cold, a current that pulled you in without your consent. No one asked him how he survived the storm. No one asked what was in the heavy black satchel that never left his side. They were too busy listening to his stories that began with distant lands and ended in whispered truths about the weakness of men, the rot in their faith, the price of survival. It wasn't until weeks later, when the first child vanished, that the people of Ashford Hollow understood what they had invited into their homes, and Gideon Thorne was no longer a guest. He was the center, the quiet pulse that every conversation circled around, the man they would follow, or the man they would fear. The first thing Gideon Thorne did was listen. Not the casual nod and smile kind of listening, but the surgical kind. The kind that left you feeling stripped bare long after the conversation ended. He sat in the corner of the Ashford Hollow Inn, the black satchel by his boots, eyes following each voice as if committing it to some internal ledger. People spoke less around him, yet somehow revealed more. Mrs. Halcombe, the innkeeper, was the first to notice. She told her sister later, in a letter that never reached its destination, that when she spoke to Gideon, she found herself mentioning things she had not even told her priest. Memories, regrets, the smallest humiliations of her life, placed in front of him without invitation, and the strangest part, she felt relieved afterward, as though a weight had shifted, only to realize days later that the relief had been replaced by a quiet dependence. She wanted to speak to him again, needed to. Within a week, Gideon knew the fractures in the town's unity, which men resented which wives envied others, which children wandered too far from home. He knew who was afraid of losing their land, who was drowning in debt, who was on the edge of leaving the church. He moved without urgency, offered help without asking for payment, a poultice for a festering wound, a strange tea for sleepless nights, a suggestion whispered to the blacksmith that tripled his business in 3 days, and with every act of aid, there was the same ritual. The satchel would open, never wide enough for anyone to see its full contents, and something unfamiliar would emerge. A vial of liquid so dark it swallowed the light, a folded cloth with faint geometric stitching, a fragment of bone, polished smooth. No one questioned him, not openly. In the winter of 1851, when the roads were frozen and the nearest help was days away, the town took whatever it could get. It wasn't until Gideon began speaking in the evenings, long after the lamps were dimmed and the snow muffled every sound, that people began to sense something else. His stories had shifted. They were no longer about where he came from. They were about what was coming for them. It began with the sheep. 2 of them found dead behind the Thornhill farm, their bodies unmarked except for a single precise incision at the base of the skull. No blood, no signs of a struggle. Just the snow pressed down in a wide circle, as if many feet had stood around them in silence. Thomas Thornhill, a man not given to superstition, brought one of the carcasses to Gideon Thorne himself. Gideon examined it with the care of a jeweler inspecting a rare stone. His pale eyes traced the wound. He touched the fur, then the exposed flesh, with long, deliberate fingers. and when he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost admiring. This one was chosen. Chosen for what, he didn't say. He only handed the carcass back and advised Thomas to burn it before nightfall. By the next morning, 3 more animals were gone. Not found dead this time, but missing entirely. The tracks in the snow made no sense, deep impressions for several yards, then nothing, as though the animals had been lifted into the air. The townsfolk muttered about wolves, but no wolf pack left such clean kills. And yet, when Gideon spoke on the matter, people listened. Predators move in cycles, he explained to the gathering at the inn. Some are not bound to the earth as you know it. They come and go with the winter's breath. You will see more. There was no reassurance in his tone, only certainty. That night he brewed something from his satchel and gave a small vial to every family. Burn this in your hearth before sleep, he instructed, and nothing will cross your threshold uninvited. The liquid hissed as it touched the flames, releasing a sharp metallic scent that lingered in the air. Some obeyed, others laughed at the idea. And it was in one of those houses, the baker's home where the vial sat untouched on the mantel, that the first human went missing. A child. 8-year-old Dan, Kyle Baker, last seen standing at the upstairs window just after midnight, staring into the snow. His tracks led from the back door into the woods, and ended less than 20 yards in, as if he had vanished mid-step. When the searchers returned empty-handed, Gideon was already waiting for them at the inn. He didn't ask what they'd found. He only said, "Now you'll understand why I'm here." By dawn, the search for Daniel Baker had shifted from frantic to hopeless. The snow was still falling, soft, heavy, and endless, swallowing the tracks, the landmarks, the memory of where anyone had already searched. Men returned to the inn with frost on their beards, and the look of those who have seen something they'll never speak of. But Gideon Thorne spoke. He stood at the hearth, hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed not on the men, but on the fire itself. "The boy was called," he said, his voice calm against the nervous murmur. "It happens in every place where the veil thins. Winter is when they can reach through. You've built your homes in a place they already own." The word they hung in the air. No one asked for clarification. No one wanted it. It was Thomas Thornhill who finally broke the silence. "And what do you know about it, stranger? You've been here 2 weeks and already there's death at our doors." A few men grumbled in agreement, but Gideon didn't flinch. His pale eyes moved to Thornhill, measuring him the way a butcher measures a cut of meat. "What I know," he said, "is that you've been blind. Your fields die in winter, your cattle vanish in storms, your children dream of voices in the snow, and you call it bad luck. I call it neglect. I call it forgetting the old agreements." The room stirred uneasily. "Agreements with who?" someone asked. Gideon smiled. "Not who. What?" He reached for the satchel and withdrew something wrapped in oilcloth. When he unwrapped it, the firelight caught on metal, or something like metal, shaped into a narrow, spiral blade, etched with symbols none could read. "These keep the doors closed," he said, "but you've let them rust." No one moved. No one spoke. Then, in a voice that somehow carried through the crackle of the fire, Gideon said, "You can drive me out, if that makes you feel safer. But if you do, I promise you, the boy will be only the first." It was not a threat. It was a fact, laid on the table like a weapon. And in that moment, suspicion didn't vanish. It turned inward, toward the snow, toward the dark woods, toward whatever might be standing just beyond the light. 3 days after Daniel Baker vanished, Gideon Thorne announced that the first closing would take place at dusk. He said it plainly, as if everyone knew what that meant. And by the way he said it, they pretended they did. The whole town gathered in the snow-packed clearing outside the old mill. Gideon stood at the center, hood drawn up, satchel at his side. The sky above was a pale bruise, the kind of winter twilight that comes too soon and stays too long. He began by walking a slow circle in the snow, dragging the tip of that spiral blade so it cut a shallow groove. Every so often he stopped to pour a pinch of black powder from a leather pouch into the cut, where it hissed faintly as if alive. The townsfolk whispered. Some clutched their children's hands. Others kept their eyes down, afraid of catching Gideon's gaze. When the circle was complete, he stepped inside and motioned for the people to join him. "This is your border," he said. "Cross it willingly, and you are safe. Cross it unwillingly." He let the thought hang. No one asked for the end of the sentence. One by one, they stepped in. He touched each person's forehead with his thumb, leaving a faint, metallic-smelling mark. Some flinched at the coldness of his touch. Others felt a strange pull, like the moment before a dream takes you. When all were gathered, he began to chant. Not loudly. The words were almost swallowed by the wind, but there was a cadence, a pattern, that made people lean forward without realizing. The fire pits at the edge of the circle flared higher, their flames taking on a strange green tint. Then came the sound. It was distant at first, a hollow, echoing knock, like something striking wood deep beneath the ground. 3 knocks, then silence. 3 more. Some claimed it came from the woods. Others swore it came from under the mill. Gideon's voice rose, not in volume but in presence. "It hears you," he said. "Now it will pass you by." The knock stopped. The wind died. The fire returned to its normal color. When the townsfolk stepped out of the circle, they did so quickly, eyes averted, and though not a single person said it aloud, they all knew something had been present that night, and it had listened. It was the Wexler family who refused. They lived on the far edge of town, where the road bent toward the frozen marsh. Abraham Wexler was a stubborn man, slow to speak and slower to bend. His wife Martha was the same. When Gideon announced the second closing would take place at the old cemetery, the Wexlers didn't even bother to come. "He's a charlatan," Abraham told anyone who'd listen. "That business with the blade and the circle is for weak minds. You keep letting him play with your fear, and you'll forget how to think at all." The words reached Gideon, of course. They always did. On the night of the ritual, snow fell in thin, sharp needles, driven by a wind that cut through coats and skin. The townsfolk stood in the cemetery, breath rising in clouds, while Gideon walked the perimeter, marking the ground with that same slow, deliberate scrape. When he was done, he glanced toward the empty space where the Wexlers should have been. "They are not here," he said simply. His tone carried no anger, no judgment, only fact. The ritual began as before, the groove in the snow, the black powder, the quiet chant. But when it ended, Gideon did not dismiss the crowd. Instead, he pointed to Thomas Thornhill. "You will walk home past the marsh," he said. "Tell me if the Wexlers' windows are lit." When Thornhill returned, his face was pale. "No lights," he said. "No fire." The next morning, a group went to check. The door to the Wexler home hung open, banging softly against the frame. Inside, the chairs were overturned, the hearth cold, and the floor dusted with snow that had blown in through the open door. There were no footprints leading away. The only marks in the snow were 3 narrow furrows, evenly spaced, running from the marsh straight to the doorway, and stopping there. The Wexlers were never found. That night when Gideon stood before the townsfolk, "No one." He interrupted him. "You see now," he said, voice low but carrying, "you cannot stand outside the circle, not here, not in winter." No one argued, not even Thornhill. After the Wexlers vanished, Gideon didn't need to raise his voice. Fear had already done the work. The townsfolk began arriving early for the closings, bringing offerings without being asked. Jars of preserved meat, bolts of cloth, small carved trinkets. Gideon accepted them without thanks, placing each into his satchel as though these were not gifts but dues. By the 4th ritual, he changed the rules. Attendance was no longer enough. Each family had to provide a token of sincerity, something that had belonged to them for years, something with a trace of their touch worn into it. "Your hands," he said one evening, holding up his own gloved palm, "are your mark in this world. What they've worn smooth, what they've bent, what they've broken, that is what binds you to what waits outside the circle. Leave it with me, and it will not follow you home." The logic was strange, but no one questioned it. Soon Gideon's home, the abandoned rectory near the mill, was filled with the town's history: a silver locket with a cracked hinge, a wood-handled knife worn to a dull curve, a pipe darkened from decades of use. One man, Samuel Carter, hesitated. His token was a rifle, the only thing he owned of his late father's. "It's not worth your life," Gideon told him, eyes fixed on the weapon. "If you keep it, you keep its shadow too." Samuel surrendered it the next day. That winter, no one went to the marsh. Children stopped playing in the woods. The mill's wheel froze solid, but no one cared. Gideon's closings became the town's clock, the only measure of time that mattered. And then the demands grew stranger. Gideon began assigning certain families to specific positions within the circle, always in the same order. He marked some with an extra line of powder at their feet, others with a pinch of ash to the forehead. No one knew what it meant, but no one stepped out. 5th place. By the time the snow started to thaw, Gideon no longer felt like a man among them. He was the wall around their lives, the keeper of their breath. And walls once built are not easily taken down. The 8th closing began like all the others, slow, deliberate, marked by the steady scrape of Gideon's blade carving the circle into the thawing earth. But the snow was nearly gone now, and the ground beneath was wet, the smell of mud and rot rising into the cold air. That night, Gideon's voice was different. It carried more weight, like a low bell tolling somewhere under the earth. "Do not break the line," he warned, though no one had moved. He poured the black powder into the groove, but when he touched it with his flame, the fire did not behave as fire should. It didn't spread. It crawled, slow and deliberate, almost aware, moving along the line like an animal feeling its way home. People shifted uneasily, their breath visible in the chill air. When the circle was complete, Gideon raised his hand, palm outward. The crowd fell silent. Then it happened. The air inside the circle grew warmer, heavy, as though someone had drawn a thick curtain between them and the rest of the world. The wind outside still howled, but in here not a single leaf stirred. And then came the sound. It was faint at first, a soft rhythmic tapping from beyond the circle, out toward the marsh. Some thought it was ice breaking. Others swore it was footsteps, slow, deliberate, each one landing with the same weight. Martha Keene made the mistake of leaning forward to listen. The moment her boot crossed the line of powder, the fire leapt, not just up, but toward her. A sudden flash, like a striking snake, and she stumbled back with a cry, clutching her leg. When they pulled her boot off, the leather was untouched, but her skin beneath was blistered. A perfect ring burned into her ankle. No one moved for the rest of the ritual. When it ended, Gideon didn't speak. He simply walked the circle again, dragging the blade as though sealing something back into the earth. Only when the last mark was made did he look up. "Do you see now?" he asked quietly. "This is not belief. This is law." No one answered. They all felt it. The truth had stepped into their world, and it would not step back. The burn on Martha Keene's ankle should have been a warning. Instead, it became a dividing line. Those who still doubted began to drift toward the back of the gatherings, shadows among shadows. Those who believed, truly believed, moved closer to Gideon, and that was when he began choosing. It happened one evening as the crowd gathered, the last light bleeding from the horizon. Gideon scanned their faces, then beckoned forward a boy no older than 12, Jacob Harlan, son of a mill hand. The boy stepped into the center of the circle, trembling. Gideon took from his satchel a small pouch, tied with a strip of leather. "Hold this," he told the boy, "and sleep with it beneath your bed." His voice was low, measured. "If anything comes to your door, it will not cross the threshold." Jacob nodded, clutching the pouch. The next morning, his family awoke to find tracks in the dirt outside their home, long, narrow prints, each ending in a sharp point, like the foot of a heron, only deeper, heavier. The trail led directly to their door, and stopped. Word spread fast. People began to wonder, what was in the pouch? What would it take for Gideon to give them one? That week, another gift appeared. A strip of cloth marked with symbols no one recognized, given to an elderly woman who had been bringing him bread at every closing. She tied it to her doorframe. Days later, during a storm, lightning struck the tree beside her home, splitting it in two. But the house itself remained untouched. Gideon never explained these gifts. He never promised them. He only gave them when he chose, and never twice to the same person. Soon the offerings to him grew heavier, not just food but tools, jewelry, heirlooms, and Gideon accepted all, though his expression never changed. Those who received nothing began to fear they were unworthy. Those who received something feared losing it, and both kinds of fear worked in his favor. By the time spring came, the closings were no longer a ritual the town attended. They were an audience with a man who decided who lived behind the wall and who stood outside it. It was Amos Cutter who broke the balance. A butcher by trade, Amos had been one of Gideon's earliest followers, always in the front row, always first to kneel when the circle was drawn. But in the weeks after the gifts began, Amos grew restless. He had received nothing. One night after a closing, Amos lingered as the others dispersed. "I've given more than any man here," he said, his voice thick with pride and something darker. "And I've kept your secrets. Maybe it's time you gave me something in return." Gideon regarded him for a long moment. "What you ask is not given. It is earned." Amos smiled. A slow, dangerous smile. "Then I'll earn it." 2 nights later, screams tore through the southern edge of town. When men arrived with lanterns, they found Amos in the yard of the Granger farm, holding one of their goats by the horns. Its throat was cut, and its blood had been smeared in a jagged line across the door. Mrs. Granger was inside, clutching her children, eyes wide with terror. "He said it was a gift," she stammered. "He said it would keep us safe." When Gideon arrived, the crowd parted without a word. Amos stood tall, expecting approval. But Gideon didn't speak. He walked the perimeter of the yard slowly, dragging his blade in the dirt until the same circular shape formed. Then he lit the powder. This time the fire rose high, too high, and bent inward toward Amos. The butcher's grin faltered. "Safety," Gideon said, his voice low but carrying, "is not bought with violence against your own." Amos tried to step back, but the flames moved with him, curling at his heels. His breath came fast. "I was only—" The fire flared once, bright enough to blind. When it dimmed, Amos was gone. The goat lay where it had fallen, its blood still wet, but of Amos there was no trace, not a footprint, not a scrap of clothing. Gideon turned to the crowd. "This is the law," he said. "It protects, and it consumes. Choose which side you stand on." No one spoke. That night the offerings doubled. The stranger arrived at dusk, riding a pale horse with no saddle and no reins. His coat was dark and heavy, though the air was warm. He did not speak to anyone as he passed through the main road, but his eyes, pale, almost colorless, took in every building, every face. By nightfall, word had reached Gideon. The man had taken a room at Mrs. Ellery's boarding house, paid in coins older than the town itself, and asked only one question: "Where does he keep the circle?" The next evening the stranger appeared at the closing. He didn't stand with the others. He stood outside the ring of fire, arms crossed. When Gideon stepped forward, the man smiled faintly. "You're the one they whisper about," the stranger said. His voice was flat, without awe. "I've come to see if you're worth the stories." Gideon said nothing. He knelt, drew the circle, poured the powder. But as the fire ignited, the stranger stepped forward, over the line, and the flames bent around him, refusing to touch. A murmur rose from the crowd. Gideon's gaze narrowed. "What do you want?" "Not want," the stranger replied. "I'm here to warn you. This—" He gestured to the circle, the fire, the faces turned toward Gideon. "Works here. But beyond this valley, there are others who draw their own circles, and they'll come when they hear your name." The air felt heavier, the fire snapping in sudden gusts. Gideon's voice dropped lower. "Then let them come." The stranger leaned closer, his pale eyes catching the light. "They won't come to talk. They'll come to take." He turned and walked away, leaving the circle unbroken behind him. The flames hissed, then collapsed inward, as if smothered by unseen hands. That night, Gideon didn't dismiss the crowd. He spoke for hours, his words turning from protection to preparation. He spoke of fortifying the town, of watching the roads, of guarding against anyone who stepped within 100 yards of the boundary. By morning, men were posted at every entrance to the valley. The gifts continued to flow, but now they were joined by weapons, oil, and powder. The people believed an enemy was coming. Gideon made sure they believed it would be their enemy, not his. The first sign came with the morning fog. It rolled in heavy from the north, thicker than any mist the valley had seen, swallowing the tree line and muffling sound. By noon, it hadn't lifted. That afternoon, a boy named Isaac Tully stumbled back into town from the northern ridge, clothes torn, face pale. His hands shook as he tried to speak. "There's something up there," he said. "Not an animal, not—" He stopped, eyes fixed on Gideon. "It knew my name." The next day, the livestock pen behind the mill was found empty. No footprints, no blood. Just an open gate that no one admitted to touching. 3 days later, Mrs. Elkins woke to find every mirror in her home shattered. Not broken outward, but inward, as if struck from the other side. At each incident, Gideon appeared calm and deliberate. He spoke little, but his presence was enough to quiet panic. Yet in private, he kept to his study longer, the candle burning well past midnight. The men on watch began to report glimpses, shapes at the edge of the fog, too far to make out, but close enough that their torches caught faint reflections. Once, one of the watchmen swore he saw a circle drawn perfectly in the dirt outside the north gate. Inside it was a single coin, old and blackened. Gideon visited the spot himself. He didn't touch the coin. He only stared at it for a long moment before covering it with earth. "They are close," he said quietly, "and they are patient." The townspeople began to sleep in shifts. The fires in the square burned all night now, but unease was a disease, and it spread fast. Conversations grew short. Laughter disappeared. People stopped walking alone. One evening, as Gideon prepared the closing, the flames flickered violently, as if battered by a sudden wind. But the air was still. The crowd felt it. That shift, that breath from somewhere else. Then came the smell. Not smoke, not burning wood. It was the sharp metallic tang of blood, and it didn't fade when the fire went out. They found the body at first light. It was Samuel Wren, the blacksmith's apprentice, barely 18, strong as an ox, gone missing the night before. His body lay just beyond the northern boundary, face down in the grass, the dew around him stained red. At first the men thought it was a simple killing, but when they rolled him over, the truth struck like ice. His chest had been marked, not cut, not burned, but branded, a perfect circle, black against the skin, unbroken except for a small gap at the top. Inside the circle was a single symbol, jagged and sharp, carved with deliberate precision. No one recognized it. No one except Gideon. He said nothing, only told the men to bring the body to the square. By the time the sun was high, the entire town had gathered. The air was heavy with fear, but also expectation. Gideon spoke clearly, his voice carrying across the crowd. "This is not an accident. This is not the work of an animal or a thief. This is a message. They want me to know they are here. And now we all know." He ordered Samuel buried at the southern edge of the cemetery, the side facing away from the valley toward the open plains. No one questioned the choice. That night, Gideon did not hold the closing. Instead, he walked alone to the place where the body had been found. The fog was thicker than ever, curling low over the grass. In the silence, he knelt and brushed his fingers over the earth. Something cold touched his hand. A coin, blackened like the one before, resting in the dirt. He turned it over. The same jagged symbol had been cut into its face. Behind him, a branch cracked. He rose, slow and deliberate, but saw nothing in the fog. Still, he spoke aloud. "You've made your move. Now you'll see mine." When Gideon returned to town, his voice was sharper, harder. He told the people to arm themselves, to keep their children inside, to trust me, a one they did not recognize. And as the fires burned higher that night, somewhere beyond the fog, a second circle was drawn in the dirt, larger, deeper, waiting. By dawn, Gideon had a plan. It wasn't one he shared with the town in full. Too many ears, too many loose tongues, but the men he trusted most were summoned to the meeting house before sunrise. On the table lay 3 objects: the blackened coins, the tattered scrap of cloth taken from Isaac Tully's torn shirt, and a map of the northern ridge. "They're testing us," Gideon said, his voice low but steady. "Every circle, every coin, every death is meant to measure my response, but they've miscalculated." He pointed to a narrow pass where the ridge funneled into a clearing. "We give them a reason to come here. Tonight. On our terms." The bait was simple, or at least it looked that way. A wagon loaded with supplies would be left abandoned in the clearing, lanterns lit, as if the driver had fled in haste. But what the enemy would not see was the ring of men hidden in the tree line, armed with rifles, torches, and powder. But Gideon wasn't foolish enough to believe steel alone would end this. He carried something else, a small, leather-bound book that had never left his side. No one had seen its pages, and no one dared to ask. By sunset, the clearing was ready. The men took their positions. The lanterns on the wagon glowed like lures in the dark. The fog, as always, came early. Hours passed. The only sound was the slow drip of condensation from the branches. Then, movement. Not footsteps, not the clatter of boots. It was a ripple, as if the air itself shifted, bending around something unseen. Torches were tightened in grip, rifles raised. From the edge of the fog, a shape emerged. Tall, still, shrouded in a cloak so black it swallowed the lantern light. It did not move toward the wagon. Instead, it turned its head slowly, toward Gideon's hiding place. Gideon stepped forward, out from the cover. The men tensed, ready to fire. But he raised a hand, stopping them. "You've been patient," he called into the dark. "Now, let's see if you have courage." The figure tilted its head, and then, without a sound, the lantern flames on the wagon went out, every one of them. The clearing plunged into blackness. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. No movement, no sound, only the sharp bite of the night air. Then came the first scream. It wasn't fear. It was pain. One of Gideon's men, Carter Hale, stumbled backward from the tree line, clutching his face. Blood poured between his fingers, dark in the moonlight. Before anyone could reach him, something moved behind the wagon, not running, not lunging, but gliding, like shadow across water. "Hold!" Gideon barked. But the men were already breaking formation, chasing flickers in the fog. The air filled with the crack of rifles, flashes lighting the mist for only a split second at a time, never enough to catch what they fired at. Then Gideon saw it. Not the thing itself, but the space it left behind. As the fog swirled, there was a moment where it pulled inward, like breath being drawn, and in that hollow stood a shape. Tall, thin, its limbs wrong, its head turned too far toward him. Gideon raised his weapon, but before he could fire, the figure was gone. Silence returned as suddenly as it had been broken. The men regrouped, shaken, their breathing heavy. Carter lay on the ground, alive but unconscious, his face marred by 3 deep slashes that formed a crude circle. And then Gideon saw what was tied to Carter's belt. A piece of parchment, folded and sealed with black wax. No one admitted to seeing who put it there. Breaking the seal, Gideon unfolded the note. There were no words, only a drawing. A perfect rendering of the meeting house. Inside, 23 small dots. 1 dot was crossed out. He looked up at the men. "They're counting us." The paper burned quickly in the torch flame, but the meaning stayed. The enemy had been close enough to touch them, to mark them, and they were not finished. Gideon turned to the map once more. The clearing had been his trap, but tonight proved something he didn't want to admit. They were already inside his walls. The town slept uneasy that night. Doors were barred, shutters nailed shut, lanterns burning until the oil ran dry. But Gideon did not return home. He remained in the meeting house, bent over the northern ridge map, tracing routes with a finger that never trembled. By dawn, his decision was made. Waiting had cost them too much. They would no longer stand guard at the edge of the fog. They would go into it. When the men gathered, their faces pale from the night before, Gideon didn't ask for volunteers. He named them. Hale, despite his wounds, insisted on coming. "If I don't go," he said, "I'll never sleep again." They carried little: rifles, powder, rope, and enough rations for 2 days. Gideon brought the leather-bound book again, the one no one dared question. Before they left, he stood at the edge of the square and addressed the rest of the town. "If we don't return in 2 days, seal the ridge path, burn it, block it, bury it. Do not come looking." The ridge loomed ahead, its trees packed so tight the fog pooled in pockets like standing water. The deeper they went, the quieter the world became. Even the sound of boots on damp leaves seemed swallowed by the air. Hours passed without sign of movement. Then, near a bend in the ridge trail, they found the first mark. A symbol carved deep into the bark of an old pine, 3 interlocking circles, the same shape cut into Carter's face. They pressed on. More symbols appeared, each one fresher than the last. And then, the forest changed. The trees grew apart, giving way to a narrow hollow where the ground dipped sharply. In the center, half buried in moss, stood a stone archway. It was not built by any hand they knew. The stones were black, smooth, and warm to the touch despite the cold. Beyond it, the fog was thicker, not drifting, but churning, as if stirred from within. Gideon placed a hand on the arch, then looked back at his men. "Once we cross," he said, "we are in their ground. We leave the rules of ours behind." Without waiting for a reply, he stepped through. The instant Gideon crossed the arch, the air changed. It was thicker, warmer, and carried a faint metallic taste, like blood left too long in the mouth. His boots sank into soil that was not mud, but something softer, like compressed ash. The men followed, their silhouettes swallowed almost immediately by the shifting fog. They had to keep close. Beyond 10 paces, shapes began to distort, bending like reflections in rippling water. It took less than an hour for the first distortion to appear. They came upon a clearing, though none remembered walking uphill. In the center stood a lone figure. A child, barefoot, head lowered, hair matted with dirt. Hale moved first, lowering his rifle. "Kid, hold." Gideon's voice cut through the fog. The child lifted its head. The face was wrong. Too symmetrical, the eyes too dark, the skin without a single blemish. Then it smiled, slowly as though testing the shape of it. In the space between one blink and the next, the child was gone. Only a perfect ring of footprints remained, circling where it had stood. From then on, the forest began to play tricks. Paths looped back on themselves, forcing the men past the same blackened stump again and again. Whispers came from nowhere, always calling a man's name, always just quiet enough that no one else could hear them. By nightfall, the group was frayed. Murphy swore he saw his dead sister sitting in the crook of a tree, humming the song she used to sing before church. Harlan claimed a hand gripped his shoulder in the dark, though no one stood near him. Gideon said nothing of the visions. He had seen his own. A woman's silhouette, standing at the edge of the fog, never moving, never speaking. He knew the face before it turned, and that knowledge chilled him more than any threat of teeth or blade. Still, he kept moving, marking each tree with a slash of his knife. But when he lanced back after the 10th mark, the cuts were gone. The forest was healing itself. And far ahead, deeper than they had yet gone, a faint rhythmic sound began, metal striking stone, deliberate, patient, waiting. The sound grew louder as they moved, its steady rhythm breaking only for short, deliberate pauses, as if the unseen craftsman were listening between strikes. Metal against stone, stone against stone. A low grind, the fog seemed to pulse with it. They descended into another hollow, the soil here streaked with veins of black rock. In the center stood a shape, tall, narrow, wrapped in strips of something that shimmered like wet leather. It was not finished. Pieces of it hung loose, swaying slightly as though moved by a breath they could not feel. Around it lay tools, if they could be called that, shards of obsidian, lengths of bone polished to points, and great flat stones with grooves worn deep from repeated grinding. Murphy crouched, picking up a piece of the leather. His fingers froze. This is... Drop it! Gideon's order was sharp enough to cut. Murphy obeyed, his face pale. Whatever it was, it had pores. From somewhere beyond the hollow, something shifted. Not footsteps. Heavier. A dragging sound. It stopped when they stopped. The structure rose nearly 8 feet tall, tapering toward the top. From a distance, it could be mistaken for a pillar. Up close, it was almost human in proportion, too much so. The strips were layered like muscle fiber, and between them, the faint glint of metal rods. "This isn't theirs," Gideon muttered. "It's meant for something to wear." The dragging resumed, closer now, and a faint, wet exhale seeped through the fog. The men formed a half-circle, rifles ready, as Gideon stepped toward the unfinished thing. Up close, he saw that the face was still missing. Only a smooth oval void stared back at him. Then the ground under his boot vibrated, not from movement above, but from below. A fissure split the dirt just behind the structure. Slow, deliberate, it widened, and a hand emerged, blackened, with fingers too long. Nails curved inward like hooks. It gripped the earth, testing it, and then another hand followed. The men tightened their aim, but Gideon raised a hand. "No," he said quietly. "If it's building a body, shooting it won't matter. We need to see who it's for." And in the silence that followed, something began to pull itself free. The thing pulled itself upward with slow, deliberate force, its long fingers sinking into the earth like roots finding purchase. The shoulders came first, broad, unnaturally so, covered in the same blackened hide as the unfinished body. As it rose, the fog around it seemed to contract, pulling in toward its shape, as if the air itself feared to touch it. It didn't have a face. Not yet. Just that smooth, featureless oval gleaming faintly in the dim light. The men stood rigid, rifles trained, but Gideon felt no urge to give the order to fire. His pulse was steady. Too steady. Some part of him knew this moment had been waiting for him long before he'd stepped through the arch. The thing's head tilted, as though sniffing without a nose. Then it froze. When it spoke, there was no movement of a mouth. The voice simply appeared inside Gideon's skull. It was not loud. It did not need to be. Gideon Thorne. The sound of his name inside his head was wrong. Too smooth, too knowing, like a memory he had forgotten, choosing to remember him. He didn't answer. "You've carried it far. The weight, the scent." Its hands flexed, dirt falling in dry clumps. The men shifted nervously, eyes darting between Gideon and the creature, unsure who was in control of the moment. Gideon's voice was calm, almost cold. "What do you want?" The reply came after a pause that felt like it was examining him. "Not want. Claim. You're almost ready." Behind the creature, the unfinished structure loomed like a shadow of what it was meant to be. Gideon understood then. It wasn't building a body for itself. It was building one for him. Harlan muttered a curse under his breath, stepping back. The thing's head turned toward him without sound or motion, and Harlan stumbled as though shoved by an invisible hand. The voice returned, softer now, and meant for Gideon alone. "I knew your father's face. You've kept his eyes, the rest we'll make better." And then, without warning, it began moving toward him, not walking but gliding, closing the distance without disturbing a single blade of grass. It stopped just outside arm's reach, the smooth void of its face inches from Gideon's. The air between them felt thick, pressing against his skin as though the fog itself had weight. No breath, no heartbeat, no sound but the slow grind of something beneath the earth, far below. The thing lifted one hand, those two long fingers curling in slow, deliberate arcs, and touched Gideon's chest. Not hard, barely there, but the moment it made contact, the world shifted. The forest vanished. The men vanished. Even the cold was gone. Gideon stood in blackness so complete it was like the absence of time. The only thing that existed was the creature's voice, surrounding him, inside him, behind his eyes. The marrow remembers. Images slammed into his mind. His father's hands covered in blood, a young Gideon standing in a rain of ash, a figure in the distance wearing his own face but taller, broader, eyes like molten gold. "We've been patient," the voice said. "The vessel grows. The seams hold. Soon you will wear what was promised." Gideon's pulse spiked, not with fear but something stranger. Recognition, as if a part of him wanted this. He felt the thing's fingers press deeper, not into flesh but into memory. His knees threatened to buckle. Somewhere far away he heard Murphy shouting his name, the sound thin and unreal. With effort, Gideon tore his mind back to the present, to the forest, to the cold, to the weight of his revolver at his hip. He grabbed the thing's wrist. The sensation was wrong. Not warm, not cold, but like gripping the edge of a dream. "I'm not yours," Gideon said. The words came out steady, but they cost him. The thing tilted its head. "Not yet." And just as suddenly as it had appeared, it stepped back. The fog folded around it, swallowing its shape. When it was gone, the unfinished body in the hollow began to twitch, strips of hide tight, teeming as though pulled by invisible hands. Harlan's voice broke the silence. "We're leaving. Now." But Gideon didn't move. He was still staring at the thing that wasn't finished, because somewhere deep in his chest, he could feel the weight of a seam beginning to split. They moved fast at first. Harlan took point, Murphy behind him, the rest fanning out in a loose line. No one spoke, not out of discipline, but because every voice would sound wrong in this place now. The fog thickened as they retraced their steps, turning the trail into a gray tunnel. Branches hung lower than before, some curling toward them like fingers. Harlan swore under his breath. "This ain't the way we came." "It's the only way now," Murphy muttered, keeping his rifle up. Gideon glanced over his shoulder. The clearing was gone, no sign of the hollow, the half-built body, or the place where the thing had stood. Just trees, too many trees. They kept moving until the air changed. It was subtle, a faint warmth at first, like the ghost of summer, then the smell of earth that had been freshly turned. And then Gideon saw it. Up ahead, the path bent in a wide arc, curving toward a rise in the ground. At the top of that rise stood another arch, not of stone, but of bone, massive, weathered, and clean. Harlan froze. "Tell me that's not—" "It's new," Gideon said. His voice was low but certain. "It wasn't here before." The others muttered uneasily. The arch pulsed. That was the only word for it. The bones seemed to throb faintly, a rhythm almost in time with Gideon's own heartbeat. Murphy stepped closer. "Looks like a way out." "No," Gideon said. He didn't know why, but every part of him understood. Stepping through that arch would not take them back. It would take them in. A sound rose from behind them, not footsteps, not breathing, more like the shift of something enormous just beneath the surface of the ground. The men turned, rifles up. The fog swallowed their aim. "Choose," came the voice, not aloud, but through the trees, through the ground, through Gideon's spine. The bone arch waited, pulsing. Behind them, the fog seemed to grow teeth. For the first time, Gideon realized there might be no leaving, only deciding which door to walk through. The air tightened as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The arch loomed above them, pale and smooth, its curve impossibly perfect, not carved, not assembled, but grown. Gideon stared at it, his mind screaming against the pull in his chest. The thing's words echoed. "The marrow remembers." Behind them, the sound in the fog grew heavier, soil shifting, roots snapping, something massive dragging itself closer without ever showing its shape. The men were losing discipline now, their fear bleeding through. Murphy's voice cracked. "We go through, or we die here." Harlan shook his head. "We don't know what's on the other side." Gideon holstered his revolver. The weight of it meant nothing anymore. He stepped forward until the arch filled his vision. It was warm to the touch, not like sunlight, but like flesh. He didn't turn to face the men. "Follow if you can." The pull became a current, dragging at his bones, urging him forward. He stepped beneath the arch. For a moment, there was light. Not the light of day, but something golden and slow, spilling like liquid through the cracks of the world. And in that light, shapes moved. Towers without tops, rivers running backward, a sky the color of old blood. The sound of the forest was gone. The sound of his man was gone. Only the voice remained, closer now, speaking as though it stood beside him. "Welcome back." And then the light closed over him, sealing him inside whatever waited beyond.